Hi, everyone. Welcome back to part two of this lecture on Modes of American Realism. And I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of set the context here and pause for a minute and talk again about realism through this work that's not realistic at all. This is, of course, Kenyon Cox's famous An Eclogue, which we've talked about before. It's an example of academic classicism or neoclassicism, basically classical aesthetics and the female nude. And as I said last time, there's something in this work that is about, you remember the term eclogue is a call and return type of poem. It's about how the artist's model, the real female, inspires the artist to create this idealized female form that then is an acceptable form of nudity in the United States, because after all, it's not about nudity at all. It's about ideals and truth and beauty and goodness and things that go all the way back through the classical tradition of Greece and Rome and the Renaissance and so forth. And as I said when we talked about this in the previous lecture, by the end of the 19th century, primarily because of the establishment of a couple of major academic centers to the art, Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts on the one hand, and the New York Academy of Design, which is where Kenyon Cox taught and exhibited his work, on the other hand, some conventional forms of European art that weren't accepted early on in the United States start to become more acceptable and even highly valued. And so, here's one example of that. Now, if you think about this relative to the work we left with last time, which is a later version of Thomas Aiken's Benjamin Rusk carving his allegorical figure of the Schuylkill River, you can see the difference, I think, pretty handily between realism and idealism. On the left-hand side, nothing's been idealized, real figures, you don't remove pubic hair and so forth, versus the work over on the right-hand side where everything's been touched up, airbrushed, turned into that classical nude. And it's interesting, the reason I put these up next to each other is, remember, both of them at a kind of implicit level are talking about the way that the artist is influenced by a real human body to create their art. On the right-hand side, there are models who pose for this. Remember, she's wearing an artist smock, the one in the blue, that then the artist, turns into a higher form of art by beautifying that form. Whereas on the left, remember, Thomas Aikens is basically saying, after he gets fired from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts, I'm not playing your game. I don't care about trying to hold back from realism or eroticism, some kind of real encounter between the artist and the model. And he now has the artist holding the model by her hand to help her down off of her stand. Again, a very realistic body. So that's a part of it. And now we move into this first major modern movement in the United States, which began to be known in the late teens and early 20s as the Ashcan School. Now, they're a group of artists who were interested in modern art, particularly realism in Europe, who were responding to the call of people like Walt Whitman to create works of art that reflected your own time period. They were also influenced, as you see here in Robert Henry's West 57th Street, New York, in the idea of drawing people's attention to the fact that a painting is an arrangement of painting brushstrokes and textures and colors and lines on a canvas, as well as being a representation of something else. We talked about this briefly before. One of the key ideas of modernism was to draw attention to the properties of each medium of expression, or to say this in another way, every single different discipline, this is both within the arts but outside of the arts, in science and philosophy and religion, had to determine what its area of expertise was. And that oftentimes meant trying to figure out what, at an essential level, each of these disciplines was. So, for instance, philosophy would determine, again, through various modern philosophers, that the root being, kind of the ontological status of philosophy was, it's all about logic. It's all about rational logic based upon particular positions. Whereas you get to religion, it would say it's all about faith. When you get to the art forms, what they tended to do is say, for instance, in painting, what is my essence? What am I before I'm anything else? I am form. I am basically pigment on a two-dimensional canvas. And so I need to draw attention to that, as well as, my ability to represent forms outside of myself. And we'll keep following this progression of modernism towards different determinations of what the essence of painting is, what makes it different than other art forms, what its strengths are, and so forth, over the next couple of lectures. So for these artists, again, associated with the Ashcan School, which was a pejorative label that people like Kenyon Cox gave them because they said it looked like their paintings were just taken out of an ash can, meaning a garbage can. Because the subjects were just genre everyday scenes, they didn't idealize their form, they didn't look like they had the same types of skills that a classical artist did. They were basically, it was a derogatory label. But what they were up to is trying to, with their subject, either, as we've talked about already, represent a subject that came directly from their modern life and their modern experience, what the world that they existed in felt like, looked like, smelled like, right? What its feelings were, trying to get to that through painting. And in some cases, although lesser so, trying to raise people's consciousness about particular social issues that they were confronting in their everyday world. Their inspirations were people like Walt Whitman, and for artists, the artist of this work, Robert Henry, again, West 57th Street. One of his favorite artists was Thomas Eakins, who, when Thomas Eakins died, Robert Henry said, Thomas Eakins was a man of great character. He was a man of iron will, and his will to paint and to carry out his life as he thought it should go. This he did. It cost him heavily, but in his works we have the precious result of his independence, his generous heart, and his big mind. Eakins was a deep student of life, and with a great love he studied humanity frankly. He was not afraid of what his study revealed to him. In the matter of ways and means of expression, the science of technique, he studied most profoundly, speaking about linear perspective and anatomy there, as only a great master would have the will to study. His vision was not touched by fashion, remember, no affectation. He struggled to apprehend the constructive force in nature and to employ in his works the principles he found. His quality was honesty. Integrity is the word which seems to best fit him. Personally, I consider him to be the greatest portrait painter America has produced. Right? So he emphasizes in this eulogy of Eakins character, painting from life, studying humanity frankly with honesty, and then perfecting your technique. Henry went on to say this about what you're supposed to be as an artist, and think of how different this stands in contrast to, let's say, a classical artist. There's only one reason for art in America, and that is that the people of America learn the means of expressing themselves in their own time and their own land, right? So here you have a subject, West 57th Street in the snow, which is, part of this man's life, what he sees every day. And he's not trying to pretty it up. He's not trying to glorify it. He's trying to show you what it looks like on a dreary, kind of snowy winter day in the gray of New York, with snow crowding the streets and covered carriages with horses pulling them, trying to trudge their way through the snow. It's just a little slice of his life, a little slice of his reality. But then the other thing that this work is about is drawing your attention again to the fact that it's a painting. It's not trying to make it look like an illusion of something else. He's trying to have it kind of both ways. A pigment arranged on the surface of a canvas that also represents in some way the feeling of New York in the winter months. And this is a big part of these types of scenes. Again, another scene here that's called Snow in New York around the same year, showing you the world as it looks, but drawing also attention to the fact that this is a painting, not trying to cover that up. A lot of their works of art are, again, drawn from the scenes that they would see. This is this really lovely work called Salome from 1909. Now, Salome, in the history of art, is a subject that comes from a biblical scene. Salome is the famous young woman who dances the dance of the seven veils, which leads eventually through a little bit of intrigue to Herod having to kill John the Baptist. And so in the history of art, it tends to be a biblical story. It's usually, frankly, a kind of excuse to show this young, beautiful woman dancing in a way that's provocatively so as to trick Herod into making a promise to kill John the Baptist. And it's oftentimes, I think, an example of the way that artists of the past, when it wasn't appropriate to have direct eroticism in their works, would represent erotic subjects but make them seem like they're a moral lesson. Like the Dance of the Seven Veils by Salome, historically speaking, is a good excuse for an artist to show you a beautiful woman dancing basically a striptease or some indication of a striptease, while still being able to say, this is horrible, look at what she's doing, she's playing the role of the femme fatale to trick this man into killing John the Baptist. It's one of those double articulations again. But here, and this is another component of modern art to keep your eye on, what we're looking at is not a biblical Salome. It's basically an erotic dance, probably in a club in New York, where the woman is dressed provocatively and dancing for the pleasure of men who look at her. That's not trying to be hidden. That's not something that the artist is saying, no, this is something else. Modern artists tended to be a lot more direct with what they thought the subject of their works were. They would oftentimes take subjects, for instance, female nudes, and instead of painting them and saying, no, this is all about the ideal, they would say very clearly, no, what this is about is men's desire for women, and they would kind of wear that in their paintings, let people see that. And that's certainly a part of this painting here. I mean, just think of the difference between these two. On the right-hand side, this work by Bouguereau again, The Birth of Venus, which is totally typical of female nudes, right? You idealize them, then you call them something like Venus to make it an appropriate subject for art. And if someone says, wow, she's really hot, you say, oh, no, it's not about her being hot or erotic. It's about beauty that's supposed to lift you into the realm of the angels. Whereas a modern artist will say, those artists in the classical tradition are really trying to cover up something that we're going to deal with directly, which is female allure, male desire. We're going to make our works about that directly rather than having to take the indirect route through, no, I'm all about beauty and the goddess of love and things of that sort. Remember how I said before that one of the things that modern artists do is they look to the traditions of the past and they say, what component of those traditions do we carry into the present moment, and which do we just, because they're no longer relevant, leave them in the past? And one of the guiding principles of that is to say, what is the essence of this subject of the past? So a modern artist like Robert Henry will look at the subject of the female nude, and he's hardly the first. Many, many modern artists before him have done this, going all the way back to the Romantic artists, frankly. And he says, the subject of this really isn't the goddess of love and beauty, Venus. It's not about her birth. That's not what that's about. What that's about is our desire for that gorgeous female body. I'm going to take all the stuff that doesn't matter out of this, and I'm going to paint it in my modern mode according to things that I see in my everyday world that are built to elicit that same desire from men. In this case, a beautiful woman acting in a provocative role as an erotic dancer. And I'm going to paint that directly. This is his portrait of one of his fellow Ashcan School painters, George Lux, just to show you. This is what they look like, by the way. They're all middle-class men. They don't come from the lower classes, but they also don't affect the style of the wannabe elites. This is him, smoking a cigarette, wearing his covering artist smock over his three-piece suit, which is what artists wore to keep their clothing clean. They still dressed, by the way, in three-piece suits. This is just one of many, many works that are just simple little studies of humans. This is Girl in a Green Coat from around 1909. I mainly bring it in to say it's a genre scene, right? It's an everyday throwaway subject, just a little kid. But it's really not even about that. What it's about is, look at this up close. Look at the way that you can recognize that this is all just easily understandable as paint on a canvas. And I'm going to get us up close on this. He doesn't try to cover this up. Whether or not this is a human being kind of has little import. It's about the arrangement of form. It's about one beautiful brushstroke with particular colors next to another one. It's about trying to draw attention to the essence of painting, which is, at its basis, it's pigment and form arranged on a canvas to provide us with a particular aesthetic effect. Right? So you get up close on these things, and remember, by the time someone like Robert Henry is painting this, Impressionism has been going like crazy in Europe since the early 1870s. You've got all the modern movements. This is basically painted around the same time that Picasso is starting to develop analytic cubism. So we're still in the United States well behind the curve if you were to judge us next to Europe, but you can see how these artists are starting to affect the styles of modern artists right at the turn of the century. Or this one, what is this called? Just Laughing Child. Same thing, just really quick, rapid brushstrokes. Or this work, Ava Greene from 1907. Same things. Genre subjects, throwaway subjects of kids, really just mainly an excuse to, create these beautiful passages of paint. Another artist associated with the Ashcan School and showing you kind of the reality of everyday life, things that, by the way, classical artists would absolutely avoid, right? This is not a highbrow subject, is John Sloan. This is his work called Backyards, Greenwich Village from 1914. And what you're seeing is, the backyard is the place that you avoid. If you, at the very best, you put on a good face of the front yard, and even a classical artist wouldn't bother with that kind of genre scene. But to show everyone's life behind the scenes, where clothes are hung up to dry even in the winter months because no one has, of course, clothes dryers, where kids are making snowmen, where cats are playing in the snow. This is just a simple genre scene that gives you a little slice of everyday life. And just like Robert Henry's work, John Sloan's work is not trying to pretend to be a photograph or an illusion of something else. It's really trying to draw attention to paint on a canvas and all of the pleasure that comes from that. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. It's a little bit of a red herring, but it tends to help students understand why, at least early on, modern artists might not be so interested in creating an idealized or even realistic likeness of something. You see, for them, idealism, that classical tradition, is something that comes from a bygone age. And why create a realistic representation of the backyard in Greenwich Village when another medium can do it way better, which is photography, which all you have to do is push the little button by this stage and you've got an accurate likeness, although not in color, of that scene. Why then should painting be trying to do something like this when another art form does it better? Painting has to figure out some other reason for being. Again, another John Sloan work here called Musgraves Bar. This is one of the Irish bars that they hung out in all the time, with paintings, their paintings on the wall, kind of a shoddy little Irish bar where people came to have a drink and to, catch up on daily activities. Hardly the highfalutin place that a classical artist might convene. Or my favorite work by John Sloan, For What It's Worth. This is 6th Avenue elevated at 3rd Street from 1928. So the roaring 20s now here. And I just want to call your attention to a couple of things. So you've got the elevated train. Elevated train, by the way, is a symbol of progress, a symbol of technical engineering, a symbol of modernism. After all, these were architectural structures, the elevated trains, that drew attention to the way that they were constructed. They didn't try to pretty it up. They didn't try to cover up the, ironwork trellis that held the whole thing up, as earlier forms of architecture would have. Earlier forms of architecture would have covered this up or turned it into classical columns to affect those earlier styles. And this is a very modern style of engineering, just showing you what something was made out of. The other thing, though, that's going on here is look at the changing gender roles. Here are the flappers out on the town on their own. They're independent. They're having fun. They're not chaperoned. They're going to go have, break the rules of what were the rules of society only a decade before. The major artist, though, associated with this movement for our purposes is George Bellows. George Bellows is the most socially oriented artist. All of these artists associated with the Ashcan School, by the way, were basically socialists. They're interested, in other words, I know this has a bad rap today, or at least people try to give it a bad rap. Like if you're a socialist, you must be a dyed-in-the-wool red communist or something like that. But what being socially oriented or a socialist Democrat means is more like Bernie Sanders today. It means that you're trying to argue for the equality of all people. You're trying to draw attention to the way that not all people have equal access to wealth, and that this world is really set up by people who already have what they have in a conservative way to keep what they have and to perpetuate these types of inequities in the world. Now, they're all, as I said, socialists, but the only one who really lets it enter his art in any direct way was George Bellows. This is his famous work called The Cliff Dwellers. I made mention of this before, but starting after the Civil War in particular, immigration in the United States explodes, right? Huge population growth, massive waves of immigrants. And whereas we are a country of immigrants after all, or most of us are, not all, of course, you have Native Americans who were here without immigration, and you have, of course, African Americans who you can't really call them immigrants because they were taken here against their will, frankly. But nonetheless, you hear what I'm saying. For the most part, people are okay with immigration all the way up until these huge explosions. And when you have huge groups of immigrants coming in, as they did in 1880s in particular, and then again right around the turn of the century, the problem is overcrowding. The problem is finding work. The problem is that it's harder for these groups of people to easily kind of integrate into the wider community, and they become more obvious visually as well as independent groups. And this leads to a lot of scapegoating and finger pointing and worries, anxieties in the United States about what happens if, they don't actually, become a part of what was then known as the melting pot of America. And so what you're witnessing here are immigrants on the Lower East Side who are stuck in these huge tenement buildings. And there's a wonderful tenement museum in New York City that kind of gives you a slice of what this life was like. But a tenement is basically a high-rise, cheap apartment building that, people who didn't have a lot of money would get crammed into, often 2 or 3 families. And you're seeing all these people from the standpoint of what this would look like. But the idea behind him painting this is he presumes that an art-going public doesn't want to see this, that this is the sullied underside of New York, that, these are populations that are acting fundamentally inappropriately according to the high art standards of, people who would go to the New York Academy of Design or something of that sort. Or another way to put this is he imagines this scene and paints it in a way in order to offend people who are conservative, who point fingers at these immigrants and say, this is the problem of America right now, that these people are going to unravel the social fabric. He puts our faces in it, but he also wants to humanize them. So the term cliff dwellers is a reference to the tenement buildings with their balconies on them like old cliffs. And then you see a whole host of things happening in here that, again, are meant to offend these people who believe that this is an unraveling of the social fabric. And I'll just take you through a few of them. One is this laundry is hung in the front yard, so to speak, out across the street, right out in the face of the public. These are not American flags, which, by the way, were oftentimes hung in this way as celebrations of American nationalism. This is people's laundry, right? And this is, again, against polite society. People outdoors in various states of undress, right? How could that be okay? This is the social fabric unraveling. But they're doing this, of course, for reasons. Their laundry's out front because maybe they don't have room out back to hang it. They're not wearing, shirts or are in various states of undress because it's New York in the summer. And if you've ever been to New York in the summer, you know it's dreadfully hot and muggy. Kids are playing around outside, games, wrestling, building pyramids and so forth without any clear chaperones around, which is a little implicit, like who's raising these kids. This woman over here appears to be breastfeeding in public, which still, for some reason, really offends people. So you have all of these activities of immigrant populations that run counter to what polite society is supposed to be doing, that is supposed to, again, create anxiety, or did create anxiety in certain groups of the populace in the United States. But he's doing it as if to say, well, if you don't like this, if you think this is a problem, then don't treat them so poorly. Give them other possibilities. Let them have other places to live. Give them other jobs. Again, when he painted this, it takes this form. By the way, this is at the LA County Museum. If you're down in LA sometime, you can go look at it. And then it was also published in a periodical called The Masses, which you'll read about in your textbook. It's a socialist journal, very closely read by a lot of these artists of the Ashcan School. And here's his print of this, where he really plays up even more the plight of these people and kind of pushes our face in all of the ways that they break the rules of polite society. Here, when he published this, it was called Why Don't They All Go to the Country on Vacation?, which was kind of like him imagining someone like a latter-day Marie Antoinette saying, why don't they all eat cake? Like a polite upper-crust Manhattan woman saying, why don't they all just go off to the Hamptons on vacation? And, of course, the irony is, of course they can't. They don't have any money for that. He was also very interested in Thomas Aiken's work, but he changes, what Aikens would have dealt with quite dramatically. This is a work called Stag at Sharkey's from 1907, and it is also, like Aiken's work, about the prize fights, which were, even at this stage, a little bit iffy when it came to their legality. They couldn't take place in public per se. They had to take place in private clubs where only men were admitted. And then, of course, boxing is a fairly brutal sport. What he's particularly interested in here is the intense kind of emotion and physicality of a boxing match. And what he's doing when he represents it adds a new term to our lexicon of modern art. He is exaggerating the forms. He's stretching them out. He's changing the colors, for instance, of their faces here, so as to really push the idea of dynamic energy and two clashing forces here. And when an artist exaggerates what something looks like, or very directly manipulates what it looks like in order to achieve an emotional effect on us as a viewer, we call that expressionism. So again, let's say, and everyone's seen this, if you've seen, let's say, mixed martial arts fighting, or you've seen boxing, even if it's just on television, every time someone really gets walloped, or you watch a sport like football and someone really gets hit, you kind of feel it in yourself. It impacts you. That is because our mirror neurons in our brain are actually responding to something we're seeing. And this artist is saying, I've seen this, but how do I represent that kind of energy or that kind of violence of one body crashing into another through paint? And the way to do it is to say, again, remember, we're starting from this premise. I don't need to be accurate to what something looks like. If someone wants to see what a prize fight looks like, go to a prize fight or look at a photograph of a prize fight. What I'm more interested in, says someone like Bellows, is creating a painting that makes someone feel what it's like to be there. And to do that, I don't need to be beholden to how it looks or reality. I can manipulate how that looks in order to achieve the effect I want to achieve. That's expressionism. So he changes the colors of the face. He makes everything, including all these muscles of the long lines through here and the elongated legs here, create greater diagonals so as to affect more energy here. Really has these bodies crash together, makes them bigger than they should otherwise be by sticking them up against the top of the canvas here, as if they're just going to go flying out of the canvas. This guy must be, judging by the height of the referee here, he's got to be like 8 feet tall or something. He's manipulating all of these things in order to achieve an effect. And then he also does something really interesting. If you look at the faces in the crowd, and I'll get us up close on a couple of these, they all turn into these kind of masks. Because what he wants to say is that energy, that violence, of course, influences the audience. They have an empathetic response to it. Every once in a while, such as this work here called Both Members of This Club, he does the same thing, but he fills it up with another set of connotations. Here you've got a black fighter against a white fighter. And around this time, a little bit before this, we're talking about, in this case, 1909, these start right before the turn of the century. It became kind of common practice to pit the races against one another in prize fights, hoping and frankly sometimes manipulating these fights so that the white fighter would win, thus proving white superiority. But also famously around this time, a couple of big black fighters won major fights, and it started to create a lot of racial anxiety in the world. So again, promoters would set up these fights as a big kind of clash of the races, knowing that everyone would flock to see these fights, making them money. But here's the dirty little secret of this. Black fighters and blacks in general, African Americans, were not allowed into these private clubs to see the fights. You had to be a club member to get in, and blacks weren't allowed to be members. They were private clubs. However, if you're a black fighter and you're brought in to fight a white fighter, they would make you an honorary member of the club for that one night so that you could get into the club and, again, perform for the crowd, be one of those entertainers for the crowd, in order to, again, they'd hope, lose, and thus prove the white superiority thing. In any case, when he paints this scene and titles it Both Members of This Club, he's pointing towards that hypocrisy and that sullied underside of the prize fights. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the series of lectures, and I will see you next week.